It is, it really is a delight to welcome back to the seminar Dr. John Hardt, who is an old friend from my time in Chicago and has become a dear friend to many of us in the TMC initiative, and more broadly, people interested in what it looks like to faithfully engage the world of healthcare, and what resources are the remarkable story of God's faithfulness to God's people offer us for doing that well. John is the Vice Dean of Professional Formation and Associate Professor of Bioethics in Loyola University's Chicago's Stritch School of Medicine. That's quite a mouthful, John. His teaching and research focuses on Catholic bioethics, neonatal ethics, end-of-life decision-making, professional formation, and physician conscience. He did his doctorate in theology at Boston College and did a postdoctoral fellowship at the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at the University of Chicago, where he and I were co-fellows. John, we're delighted to have you back with us today, speaking about a Christian vision of time. And before you begin, I want to remind folks that if you have questions that come to your mind along the way, use that Q&A function to type those in. You can do that as we go. I will then present as many of those as I can to Dr. Hardt at the end of his initial comments, and we'll engage in conversation together. So, John, welcome.
All right, thanks so much. It is, the treat is mine to be with all of you, and I'm so grateful for the invitation. And I am such a fan of what you're all doing down there. So thanks for having me. I'm fighting a bit of a cold, so forgive me if you see me dabbing my nose, and hopefully my voice is going to hold out. My talk today is going to proceed in 4 parts. And the first part, I'm going to try to describe what I see as an inherent tension for Christian practitioners of healthcare, physicians, nurses, etc. And that is the tension between our thinking about our work as a ministry and healthcare as it's perceived as a business in the United States. Second, I'm going to talk about how it is that we think generally about time today. And then I'm going to say just very briefly a few words about how we got to this conception of time and how deeply far away it is from a Christian conception of time, which will occupy the third part of the talk. And then I'm going to conclude with just a few remarks about what I think we might want to do as we think about a way forward, if you find the tension that I'm describing to be something that you're either living or that you anticipate living in your future work. So with that, I'll get underway here. This first part, describing the tension, I want to start with 3 brief stories that brought me to my obsession with time. But the first thing to say is that my comments and thinking on this topic have been heavily shaped by John Swinton in his wonderful book, Becoming Friends of Time, which looks at the issue of time through the lens of disability. And it was actually a conversation with John that I had many years ago when he was writing that book. If I remember, we might have been at Duke having that conversation, where it was clear that he was interested in the topic and was beginning to work on a book on it. And he and I discussed a quote I had found by Kosuke Koyama, theologian, scripture scholar, Japanese. And he and I both kind of mutually attached to this quote that I'm going to be bringing us to later. But I wanted to mention John's work. Here's the first story. I'm a dad of a freshman in high school and a 6th grader, and much of my summers and falls are spent on the sidelines of soccer fields, like many of you. And I've noticed in recent years how oftentimes when chatting with parents, the first thing that happens is when you say hi and say, how are things going? People respond with a tremendous amount of uniformity by saying, oh, I'm so busy, I'm swamped. And I found myself saying the same thing. And what disturbed me about it is that I found myself saying it when it wasn't even necessarily true. I realized that I was wearing busyness as a kind of badge of honor, a way of looking professional, of playing the appropriate role of a suburban dad with a job, watching his kids play soccer on the weekend. That got me wondering about how much of my own life is shaped, and maybe shamed by a framework of busyness. Second story. For many years, I would give a talk to our to our medical residents in our Department of Medicine. It's obviously, like most places, I presume, our biggest residency. And they would ask me to come and speak about the mission of our health system as a Jesuit and Catholic health system. And I had given the talk and had given what I'd hoped were inspirational and hopeful remarks to the group. And at the end of it, the chief resident stood up and posed a question saying to me, "Dr. Hardt, thanks so much for a beautiful presentation." He said, "You have described what brought me into medicine. What I need to tell you is that I can't be the kind of doctor you've described." And he went on to talk about the compression of time in his life, the pressure for efficiency, the insurmountable amount of work that had drained from him in his training years his hope for a life that would be shaped by the kind of physicianship that I had described. Again, I was reminded of this challenge of time in busyness, now specifically in a healthcare environment. Third and most recent story. This fall, I was talking with a physician parent at a soccer game who works at another one of the large academic medical centers here in Chicago. And I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, thank God I'm okay." And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Frank. I'm not sure what you're referencing." And he said, "Oh, forgive me. I thought you knew." He said, "I had a serious heart attack." And I said, "Geez, I'm so sorry to hear it. What happened?" He said, "I was at the hospital, thank God." He does breast cancer work. And he said, 5:45 in the morning, came off the elevator bank, walking down the hallway, collapsed. He said, "Thank God colleagues were in the hallway, grabbed me, got me down, stented me. They saved my life." And I said, "That's extraordinary, Frank. I'm so glad you're okay." And he said, "Well, I am too, John, but you know what's really extraordinary?" And I said, "No, tell me." He said, "I'm liking medicine again." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "John, my colleagues will not allow me to work for more than 6 hours a day while I recover." And he said, "They have taken over significant amounts of my workload, and I find myself loving the practice." He said, "I take my time with patients. I still come to work early because I'm a morning person, but the days feel like they're as much mine as they are other people's. And it has renewed my hope for what it might mean for me to be a doctor for the rest of my life." So these three things, in addition to coming to chat with John Swinton and reading his work, have brought me to a little personal obsession with this topic, friends. And here I think then is the basic tension. Through the lens of Christian faith, those of us who work in healthcare, and especially those of you who are clinicians or clinicians in training, I suspect are inclined to think about your work as a kind of ministry. And yet we're hard pressed to find anywhere in the United States a place where it wouldn't feel mostly like a business, driven by metrics of efficiency and productivity, which is appropriate in many regards for what businesses do. It is worth noting that our English word business comes from the root of the word for busyness. What I want to suggest today is that if we're serious about either being a successful healthcare business or being a ministry, we need to acknowledge that these kinds of institutions work with very different conceptions of time, meaning a ministry or a business. I want to try to suggest that if we don't get our understanding of time right, we won't get much else right in trying to manage this tension. Part two, how do we think about time today? Well, I think about it in a way that is generally linear, constantly moving forward and constantly exerting pressure on days and nights. In fact, here I am giving a talk on time And I'm worried that my introductory section went on too long already. So I'm feeling like I need to hurry. I know all of you feel this way most every day. Time as we understand it, friends, clock time, iPhone time, is a human creation. It is an instrument of measure that is not tied to anything real. The Greeks were aware of this in a way linguistically that we in the English-speaking world don't really attend to. As many of you know, if not all of you, they spoke of chronos, clock time, human manufactured time, and kairos, the fullness of time, or God's time. It's not lost on me that I worked in a health system for 6 years where people would punch in to a software system called Chronos to keep track of their work hours. It is one of the largest providers of timekeeping software in healthcare and other businesses today. And boy, is it appropriately named. So if we think of time as linear, as moving forward, as exerting pressure on us, it is also the case then that we use it as an instrument of control, a tool to be deployed to achieve our personal ends. It is the resource by which we strive. I think that I've shared this story with Farr in a different context before, but it's good to be reminded that time does not need to be thought of this way. When my now 14-year-old son was a preschooler, he took his requisite trip to the fire department to play on the trucks with his classmates and meet the firemen and women and sound the siren. And I remember coming home that night and lying next to him in his bed as he fell asleep. He was a horrible sleeper. And we spent many a night army crawling out of his room, hoping the floor wouldn't squeak to not wake him. So I was lying next to him and I was asking him about his day, and he was recounting the trip to the firehouse. And without missing a beat, lying next to the sweet, warm body in his bed, I said to him, "Boy, Seamus, do you think maybe one day you'd like to be a fireman, or you could be a police officer?" There was a long, pregnant pause, and I listened to his breathing, and I started to think, why is he not answering me? Did he fall asleep? And then I heard a still small voice that said, "Dad, is it okay if I'm just your boy?" I share this story as a concrete reminder to me of two different conceptions of time. He knew exactly where he was supposed to be as a preschool-aged boy. And here I was planning his life 20, 30, 40 years forward on a career trajectory. There was, of course, no malice or bad intention in it. It was conversation. But what a beautiful reminder for me of someone who seemed to be aware of just what he was, whose he was, and how he existed in time. To drive home the point of the difference between our contemporary conception of time and what I'm going to move to shortly when we talk about how we got here and a Christian conception of time, let me just briefly call your attention to the way we talk about time. Listen to the verbs we attach to it. What do we do with time? We save time, we borrow it, we waste it, we manage it, we steal it. Do you notice that almost all of the words, and I could give you 10 more, are economic? Save, borrow, manage, waste, steal. It is no wonder that we don't even blink when we hear the phrase time is money. We have turned time not only into a tool of efficiency, but a tool of profit. We'll come back to that, but let me just say that it hasn't always been that way. I'll be brief here because I suspect many of you are familiar with at least pieces of this. But time in the Western world, as we think about it, meaning clock time, is really a gift given to us by Benedictine monks. And I say this proudly, working at a Jesuit institution. It's always nice to be able to blame the Benedictines for something. It was Benedictine monasteries that created the clock tower, the bells that would toll to bring the men and women of those monasteries to prayer. The bell tolled to call those people from the busyness of their lives, the working for their livelihoods, back to God's presence. When the bell tolled, the aim was an integration of physical work and transcendent. Ora et labora, as the Latin monastic phrase indicates, prayer and work, praise and labor. There was, in those early days of beginning to measure time in incremental sections, a rhythmic integration of the transcendent in our human work, rather than a frantic pressure that was pacing our days and nights. But as histories of time tell us, it wasn't long before that bell tower of the monastery became the clock tower of the town square. All of a sudden, clocks started showing up in the middle of these kinds of engagements in town living. And shortly thereafter, with the Industrial Revolution, one of the highest compliments one could pay a factory worker was to say, he's as regular as clockwork. Again, noting the place of efficiency and productivity in time understood as chronos. Very quickly in all of our lives, time as an economic function takes over. And I just want to make the observation that if time is money, then rushing makes more of it. And cramming as much in as possible is then tied to profit. Now, I don't want to be unrealistic about our lives, friends. There is a time for agility and speed and adaptability. What I want to call our attention to is a challenge that I think is more subtle for those of us who think about Christian healthcare as a ministry. It's that time as an economic function so dominates our lives that we don't see that what we need to live, we don't see that we need to live in multiple speeds, dependent upon the spheres in which we're in. Efficiency and productivity are wonderful goods, but they are not the only goods. And to excel at efficiency and productivity can cost us in areas that we may, were we to slow down and notice, not want to participate in. Some of you may be familiar with the study that Princeton Theological Seminary did some years ago now, where they engaged in kind of a psychological, spiritual research study using the parable of the Good Samaritan, asking, I think they were students in seminary, what it would be that would stop them from stopping to help the wounded person on the side of the road. It wasn't ego, it wasn't a sense of self-importance, it wasn't callousness. What they discovered was that the answer was that people imagined they would be too busy to stop. They would be pressed for time. Very little good comes from rushing in our lives, friends. When we are rushing, when we are frantic, when we operate with a sense of urgency, we oftentimes slip into a framework of opposition, of tension. My daughter, who's younger than my son Seamus, had a habit when she was a little girl of really taking her time when it was time to brush her teeth. And I remember one evening being very tired and very frustrated and just desperately wanting the kids to go to bed, while I was watching my daughter for the better part of 5 minutes, spinning, singing, and dancing in the hallway with a toothbrush in her hand, occasionally brushing her teeth, and then stopping to begin singing again. And I can remember my voice rising repeatedly, Tess, 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 enough, brush your teeth. Another pause, eyes welling with tears. And she looked at me and said, Dad, when you talk like that, it's hard for me to agree with you. How often in the halls of our hospitals, in meetings, Do I witness similar interactions of people not only rushing past the person on the side whose attention is desperately needed, but also engaging in short and terse conversation filled with anger and frustration because of a necessity or a perceived necessity of speed? Let's move on to my third part before the conclusion. So what then is the Christian alternative to thinking about time? Well, there's much to say here, and John Swinton has said some very beautiful things, and I'll be referencing some of his work through this section. But perhaps the first thing to note is that God creates time. Notice that God does not create in time in the narrative of Genesis, but first, God creates time by separating the night from the morning as an initial creative act in the narrative. Time itself is a creation of God. It is not just the vehicle of creation. Is it possible, as hard as it would be for us to believe, that this could mean that there is always enough time, precisely because God made it? We may not achieve our plans in time, but we believe in a God who redeems us and our time and makes the world new and whole in the end. It is a profound statement of faith that I think few of us successfully believe, to think that if God makes time, of course there is enough of it. And then, of course, there is the astonishing moment of Christianity, the historical pinnacle of salvation history, which is the incarnation, when Jesus enters time. Ignatius of Loyola has a wonderful meditation where he imagines the three persons of the divine Trinity talking to one another, looking at the mess that the world is and saying, what are we going to do with this? How has this happened? One of us has to go. And the Son is chosen to enter time. So what do we see when Jesus enters time? We don't see that time is a vehicle for productivity and efficiency. We mostly see that time is a vehicle for teaching, for healing, and for saving. I'm going to close this section with just three brief observations of themes. Jesus' understanding of time and his use of time is characterized by love, by gentleness, and by rest. First John tells us, in probably the most succinct definition we have of the divine in the Christian scriptures, that God is love. I referenced before that theologian, the scripture scholar Kosuke Kiyama, who wrote this beautiful book. My copy is falling apart, as you can see, called 3 Mile an Hour God. I stumbled upon this when I saw a footnote in a Pope Francis homily early in his papacy, and he referenced this book, and I was intrigued by the title. So I bought a used copy from Amazon, and the first essay in this collection is called 3 Mile an Hour God. Let me just briefly read from it to try to make the point about time being characterized by love in Jesus's ministry. Kiyama writes, "We live today an efficient and speedy life. We believe in efficiency. Let's not just look at this negatively. There's a great value in efficiency and speed. But let me make an observation. I find that God goes slowly in his educational process of humankind. 40 years in the wilderness points to his basic educational philosophy. 40 years of national migration through the wilderness. 3 generations of the united monarchy, Saul, David, Solomon. 19 kings of Israel. That brings us up to 722 BC. And 20 kings of Judah. The hosts of the prophets and priests, the experience of exile and restoration. Isn't this a rather slow and costly way for God to let his people know the covenant relationship between God and his people? God walked slowly because God is love. If he is not love, he would have gone much faster. Love has its speed. It is an inner speed. It is a spiritual speed. It is a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we are accustomed. It is slow, yet it is Lord over all other speeds, since it is the speed of love. It goes on in the depth of our life, whether we notice or not, whether we are currently hit by storm or not, at 3 miles an hour. It is the speed we walk, and therefore it is the speed the love of God walks. I'll sometimes use this quotation when I'm teaching nurses because it is such a peripatetic kind of work. The movement from room to room, the constant walking, is a reminder that we are capable of moving at the speed of love in healthcare. To slow down is to see and to hear and to recognize what is happening all around us. Moving at a quick pace dampens the senses. How is it that we might slow down to be more capable of loving? Jesus' use of time is characterized by gentleness. I remember well the first time I heard John Swinton tell this story when he was living in a large community, and one of the residents had gone to see his cardiologist that day. The resident had Down syndrome and had regular appointments with the cardiologist. And John was engaging his housemate at dinner and said, "Hey, how was the doctor's appointment today?" And this gentleman said, "Oh, it was really good." And John said, "Well, what did the doctor do?" And his housemate responded, "He looked into my heart." And John said, "Well, what did he see when he looked into your heart?" And his housemate responded, "He saw Jesus resting." It's hard for me to tell that story without asking myself every time, could Jesus rest in my heart? Would he find it an environment suitable for rest? Would he find our clinics and hospitals, our encounters with our patients, places that are suitable for rest? Which brings me to the third characteristic. In addition to that kind of gentleness, Jesus uses time for rest. I won't belabor the point, but we know how often Jesus retreats after various ministerial engagements for a kind of recovery. And of course, there is the gift given to us of the Sabbath, mandated rest. Isn't it interesting to note, friends, in that creation narrative, that it's only at the end of each day that God looks backward and says, "That's pretty good." It's from a place of rest that we have moral clarity in discerning what's of real value in our lives. I've started to think that as a business principle, slowness is a character trait of discernment. Rushing never really yields any good results. One exception there might be in emergency medicine, and I'd be open to talking about the ways that emergency medicine challenges some of these concepts. I find that fascinating in itself. To briefly conclude, as we think about what could we do if anything I've said thus far has resonated with you. First, we need to begin thinking more concretely about time in our personal lives and in our ministries as healthcare providers, as doctors, as nurses. Just to be aware of how many times you check your watch to develop a discerning culture that attends to time. I don't know that this is any model, but I was struck recently reading an interview with Jeff Bezos of Amazon, where he says that there's a company policy that when documents are to be read in preparation for a meeting, they don't read them in advance. The meeting begins with 30 minutes of quiet for people to read the document together before anyone says anything. There's something that drew me to that is a practice of real intentionality in community, using quiet to focus our attention, to have robust discussion and make good decisions. How rarely do we see those kinds of habits modeled in the business world today? We need to ask ourselves where we encourage productivity, efficiency, and speed, perhaps at the unnoticed cost of carrying out a ministry that looks like anything that Jesus would have imagined. And then maybe more concretely, and I know I'm aware of this in our own health system, what would it mean to think about compensation plans, for example, for physicians and others that don't reward franticness and productivity, but other metrics? Where can we remove unnecessary bureaucracies that take time away from what we're called to do by way of ministry, and reporting structures that freight time with fear and anxiety and undue worry that pulls us away from the things we should be caring about? I could go on, friends, but I'd much rather hear you reflect on this and think about anything that might have struck you of value here. So let me just close by thanking you and FAR and the team there for this wonderful invitation to be with you today. I'm very grateful for it.
Friends, thank you, John. If you would like to ask a question of Dr. Hardt, we would welcome that. You can either type it in the Q&A or you can use the reactions button at the bottom right of your Zoom screen to raise your hand, and then I'll call on you. If I call on you, you'll be able to speak your question. Man, John, you left off lecturing and went to preaching at some point in there. And it's a word that hits home, I imagine, for almost all of us. And I thought, how ironic if Jeff Bezos turns out to be a kind of prophetic witness to our disordered habits of time.
Wouldn't that be something?
Be something. But you mentioned the clock tower in the Benedictine community calling people to prayer in a way away from their busyness, not because it's a problem, but to integration of their activity centered in their prayer together. Or do you see ways that kind of a practice of being in the pace of things as they are, this is not to just give up on slowing down, but of there being ways to choose kairos by putting in timed, specific times of on the clock times of prayer?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple concrete examples that come to mind for me, FAR. So I don't know who on the call may work in Catholic healthcare, but there are some Catholic health systems who actually do have built-in prayer time over the PA in the hospital, where there is an intentional pause. It is, in my anecdotal experience, it is met with mixed reviews. Some people find it highly disruptive. Others worry about unnecessary noise. I don't think it's communicated directly into patient rooms, but it's communicated in the hallways, and others love it. A reminder of the mission of the place, right? And what they're called to. My son is in a Jesuit high school, the one that I went to, and we didn't do it, but they daily have a pause where they do a school-wide examen of conscience for 8 minutes. And he has told me that he really likes it. that it's kind of a nice time to recenter and think about God for a minute and think about who he's being that day. So I think in the right kind of context, that can happen. For those of us who are Christians working in a secular environment, that would need to be more communally driven and planned, right? Um, but it can certainly happen. I mean, we did, driven by a cluster of students who wanted to do it. The med school did Eucharistic adoration last week, and we do that once every 2 weeks in the medical school for students who want to seek it out. And we also have a prayer room for our Muslim students, which I'm always deeply moved by for those who need to and want to commit to their daily prayer. And to see them, walk down to that room with prayer mats in hand, and then we keep prayer mats in there. I'm always struck by that kind of, it's a reminder of something akin to what the Benedictines had, which was that regularized integration of the transcendent in the work of daily living. I guess my last thought on it, Far, would be there is no substitute for prayer, right? Whether it's private or individual or communal. The kind of pause and quiet that can allow us to remind ourselves of who we are and whose we are can be profoundly valuable. I know that I do that when I get to work. I usually try to take 5 minutes just sitting in my car in the parking lot to remind myself, no matter how bad a mood I may be in, the second I get out of my car, dressed like I am here with the Loyola name tag on, I'm representing the institution and its mission, right? So I try to call myself to remind myself of that and to ask God to allow me to be the kind of person who could live into the vision of what I think our kinds of places should be, which are places deeply characterized by love, healing, and gentleness. So I don't know if that gets exactly at what you were going for, but that's where I'd start.
Yeah, thank you, John. When you said remember whose you are, I think remember that as you're putting on that name tag, you are also just the Father's little boy.
Always, right?
Yeah, to quote Seamus.
Yeah, my beloved son. Yeah.
There's a question from Martha Carlo. John, where have you seen practitioners and medical educators succeed in creating or modeling Kairos moments in the healthcare workday, and how can we be creative here? I guess you've begun to respond to that in that last question, but is there anything else you'd say?
Yeah, I mean, Martha's at least roughly familiar with a program I run called the Physician's Vocation Program, which is an effort to invite a self-selecting cohort of medical students into a 4-year voluntary curriculum looking at medicine as a Christian calling. And within that, we not only work on habits of prayer, the practice of spiritual direction, but we also invite students to locate within the clinical environment the kinds of markers that would allow them to become self-aware again of who they are and whose they are, right? And I've shared this story with some of you, no doubt, but early on in the Physician's Vocation Program, we had a wonderful student who was a graduate of University of Notre Dame. He played football for him. And he's now a MD PhD scientist. But he, when we asked them to think about when they would start doing rotations to notice places where they could allow themselves to reconnect, he mentioned gelling his hands before going into a patient room. And he said, Dr. Hardt, it occurred to me that every time I'm rubbing my hands together with that gel on them, I'm reminded of the image of the priest washing his hands before he touches the Eucharist in the Catholic Mass. And he said, what would it mean if I took that 30 seconds to think about the fact that I'm going to encounter the body of Christ in that patient I'm about to meet? So I think that, like so much of human activity, Martha, habituation and attentiveness really matters, right? It's why speed can be the enemy of that. I mean, Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, her second chapter called Seeing, she starts by saying, there are flashing gold pennies everywhere in the world if you only have eyes to see them, right? And she makes this remark about how she would hide pennies as a young girl, so excited at the thought that people would find pennies and be excited by them. And she goes on to observe how easily we walk past a penny, paying no attention to it. In part because we're in a hurry and we haven't trained ourselves to see what's right in front of us. And the training of the senses requires slowness, I think, not speed. So I'm a big fan of habits for that reason, Martha.
Thank you, John. I see a few of you guys have turned your cameras on. It's good to see your faces. Any of you have a question, Aaron or Warren or Carl?
I spent 2 months last spring at St. John's University at the Collegeville Institute. And St. John's is a Catholic university, as you may know, around an abbey. And every time they pray, they ring these loud bells from the top of campus. And I was talking to the monk who was a resident at the institute with us, the 10 of us that were there, and he said, "Well, we ring the bells to remind everybody that you're on the grounds of a monastery, and that people are praying for you, whether you're awake or not. And sometimes I'm glad that the bells wake the undergraduates up because it reminds them that people are praying for them, whether they're at prayer or not." And he said the bells structure time on this place because really it is a monastery with a university attached. And I thought about those bells every time I heard them, about the ways that, they so pervaded campus because you could hear them everywhere. And the way in which that reminded everyone, whether you wanted to think about it or not, that people were praying for you on a regular basis every day. And how that changed sort of the spirit of the place and their sense of time. Like, everybody got reminded that prayer was going on a very strict schedule that, structured the way that the people who ran the university did their work. And it was kind of moving. So when you were talking about time, I thought about those bells and the ways in which that's so different than so many other institutions of education.
You are not kidding. It sure is. Yes. Yeah.
John, in a place like Duke, we're not going to have such bells. We have phones, and I've noticed some folks will have apps that kind of ring a bell.
Yeah.
It's kind of different, it's individualized and so on. Your thoughts about those efforts to kind of use the technology, the Chronos technology, to remind us, turn our minds to Kairos?
Yeah. No, there are some wonderful, in my experience, some wonderful apps out there to promote pretty serious spiritual reflection, So I'm a fan. I mean, given my context, both the British and Irish Jesuits have wonderful daily prayer sites. The Liturgy of the Hours in the Catholic tradition is available on multiple excellent websites that can be listened to or read. So I think in some ways, the resources have never been more available to us. They tend to be highly individualized, right? And I think that there's a cost in that. When we're called to be, in the Christian tradition, the body of Christ, it's good to be able to come together as a body from time to time. But I'm also reminded of one of my favorite stories about the early Jesuits is as Ignatius would send his men out across the globe, very rarely ever seeing them again, and knowing that many of them would die on the journey. They would find, when they would recover bodies of the early Jesuits, they would find stuffed in the pockets of their robes the clipped signatures of their Jesuit brothers from letters that they had received from them. And they developed this habit of simply carrying the names of their Jesuit brothers with them on their journeys as a way of reminding themselves that they're not alone, right? While they are geographically alone and they might be filled with fear or loneliness, they were part of something bigger with people, to Aaron's earlier point, praying for them and thinking of them and worrying about them. So I think that, we can bridge that. We can bridge the divide of the isolation that comes with our technology by locating ourselves within larger communities that might use similar technology in a way that allows us to live those kinds of lives. When I do our nursing orientation, I invite our nurses to think about whose names they would carry in their pockets, right? To say, this is stressful and demanding education, and the work is going to take a lot from you. Whose names would be in your pockets, right? Don't do this alone. Think about who you would want to be joined with in the journey. So I'm generally a huge fan of what's available. I think some of it is really excellent. But I think that we should keep striving to figure out how we can establish community as well.
Thank you. Carl, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed this talk.
Thanks, Carl.
I've been, can you hear me? What? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
You're great. Yeah.
One thing that I've been thinking about during this talk is, time as something that serves to coordinate activity and therefore can serve to coordinate relationships, and I think one other way in which, time as an instrument can be sanctified or redeemed is to be put to that end. I feel like it's hard to get people in the same space, even sometimes, and to your point about building community, I think it's a beautiful way to, say, hey, like in our so-called busy lives, like let's reserve, this hour or this half hour or this whatever to do stuff together. And I think without a kind of precise instrument, so to speak, it can be hard to coordinate relationships in a certain way. And obviously, there's a lot of anxiety that comes from tracking time and being beholden to it and all that. But I think there is kind of a possibility to say, well, just like we can create, common spaces, geographic spaces that have clear delineations, right? Like let's use the instrument of time to create, common times, that we can spend with each other and kind of sanctify, separate from the rest of the way in which we're belonging together. So I don't know. I've just been, really enjoying this talk, and that's something that came to mind as you were sharing.
Thank you, Carl.
That's so beautifully said, Carl. Just a brief comment about it. I mean, one, that is certainly part of the monastic tradition of the bell calling the community together, right? They're spread all over the place and they come back to the church for prayer. But, sometimes I'll engage people in an exercise while I'll ask them to describe for me the things in their life that they love most. And none of them are things characterized by speed, right? It's vacations, it's sleep, it's meals with friends, it's woodworking, it's fishing, it's listening to a good piece of music, it's playing the guitar, right? And it's a very interesting exercise to realize that the things that we generally think to be most important and most enriching tend to be slow activities, right? I mean, that you hope that you're not in a hurry for the dinner party to end, because it hasn't been a good dinner party if you are, right? So I think that your point is a really good one, and yet we have to work so hard to protect time to do the things that we actually love, and I think that speaks to your point very nicely.
Nate Smith, did you have a comment or question? And Jim, I'll come to you right after that.
No, thank you. I'm really enjoying the talk and the discussion.
Okay, great. Jim, go ahead.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, you're good, Jim.
John, I really, really enjoyed the talk, and it hit home in two major ways. As an oncologist, one of my first lessons was shrinking time so I could listen to what my new patient's journey had been
Yeah.
before I had to jump on their journey.
Yeah.
And that's something that oncologists alone are not the only clinicians who need to do that.
Yeah.
The second is the tendency as trainees that we found shortcuts because of time to represent the world around us. And the one that is most personal to me is when my oldest son developed type 1 diabetes at the age of 10.
Mm.
And I was thinking, when I was seeing patients with diabetes, they weren't patients when I was on rounds. It was the diabetic in room 3 or the heart attack in room 5. And it hadn't struck me that I'm teaching my students and helping them to go down the wrong path of time perception as clinicians by imparting those kinds of shortcuts. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that in terms of teaching young clinicians to be on a path that better suits not just their own character, but the needs of their patients. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Such a beautiful comment. I mean, a couple things come to mind for me. But just briefly, some of you know my dear colleague, Father Dr. Dave DeMarco. Dave's a Jesuit priest and internist, and he celebrated our St. Luke's Mass not that long ago in the med school. And for his homily, he told the story that happened to him fairly recently of preparing to go into a patient room of a young 26-year-old man with diabetes, fully out of control. And he'd been briefed by the resident that the patient had a really tough history of non-compliance and was not an easy person to talk to and difficult in 10,000 ways. And Dave commented in his homily how he'd kind of geared himself to go in there and play the heavy, right? He was going to be the attending and say, listen, you're going to kill yourself. You got to pull your act together. This is what you need to do. And he said he's still thinking through what came over him, but as he was walking through the threshold of the door, he shifted his mindset. And he said he walked in and sat down and introduced himself. And he said to this young man, he said, I have no idea what it must be like to be 26 years old with this horrible disease. Can you tell me what it's like? And the guy broke down in tears and proceeded to tell this narrative of his life and how the disease has affected him and all of his fears. And out of that came a clinically successful and very therapeutic interaction, right? But it took some time. My heart breaks for you, Jim, and others who I know enough of your life as doctors to appreciate the pressure you're under, because in some ways it has to be an act of quiet resistance. And there is, with skill, no doubt, a way to make the most of the compressed time that you have, to expand that time through carefully chosen words in a ministerial presence as Christians in the clinical environment. But, part of me wants to call for the revolution. I mean, I've said a couple times, I want our health system to be the kind of place where people walk out the doors and look at each other heading to the parking lot saying, how could such a place exist? How could there be such a place where human beings love one another? That should be our standard if we're going to call ourselves a Catholic health system. People should leave dumbstruck at the possibility of having encountered the kind of love that we demonstrated through our care of them. And that is not generally what I hear people saying when they leave our health system. So I think a lot of that is a culture built around efficiency and productivity that's characterized by shortness, tension, and stress. And there is nothing in any of those words that approximates hospitality, right? Which is the root, as we often talk about, of the word They share a common root, hospital and hospitality. So, and here's my only other comment, Jim, because you said it so beautifully as you started talking about, I forgot what verb you used, but as you attach yourself to a patient's life, or what did you say, Jim?
Get on
Do you
board.
remember? Yeah, get on board. You know, when I talk to our med students about hospitality, they're inclined to think that they're the hosts in the hospital, right? And I ask them to remember that they are actually the guests of their patients' lives. And a good guest doesn't walk in and say, "What time are you going to serve dinner?" A good guest doesn't demand to be on their own schedule, right? A good guest receives the time necessary of the host. And I want to encourage our med students to think of themselves as guests in their patients' lives. But I am haunted by the voice of that chief resident saying, "Dr. Hardt, you described the kind of doctor I want to be. You built a health system that doesn't allow me to be it."
And I was struck by that as well, John, and that some of what you described suggests all you need to recover being that doctor is to run into a wall, like your colleague who had a heart attack, something that jolts us out of the presumptions and the anxieties and the fears that are driving us. John, you've been a good guest to the TMC seminar, and we thank you for joining us, and we thank everyone else who's come today, and we look forward to seeing you again in seminars to come. I forgot to look ahead to see when our next seminar is, but we will see you soon, and thank you again.